we're living examples that eating the right salt with the right diet combined with fasting is working for us. But the belief is salt is still going to cause high blood pressure. So I appreciate the explanation.
Yeah, it is definitely not the cause. It is a factor in the story. But again, for individuals that are sodium sensitive hyper-responders, they are typically insulin resistant. Mm-hmm. And even sodium restriction doesn't necessarily help that much.
Yes. Dr. Mindy in the house. All right.
I appreciate that. The carnivore diet.
Because of what we eat.
Honestly, you've really touched my heart.
And here's my little first question for you is, why the heck do we need electrolytes so badly? I'm blown away at watching so many people fast and watching so many people have like their hair fall out. They have heart palpitations. They hit walls with fasting. And what I've come to realize is that there is this imbalance of electrolytes in the human body right now. So explain why we need it and why are so many people deficient?
Yeah. And, maybe I will throw myself under the bus first before throwing you under the bus second. and so we're both fairly svelte, so we'll both fit under the bus. But if somebody goes on a low carb ketogenic diet, usually there's a ton of focus on protein, carbs, fats, and don't allow your carbs to go above this particular level and whatnot. And there is absolutely no discussion typically of electrolytes, specifically sodium. But if we are placed on a medically supervised ketogenic diet, for like epilepsy or adjunctive cancer therapy or what have you, that doctor or that dietitian will make absolutely dead certain that the individual gets at least 5 grams of sodium a day, sometimes double that, because those folks are savvy to this concept called the natriuresis of fasting, the loss of sodium associated with fasting. And as individuals, so within popular, low carb diet lore, which I've been in that scene for like 23 years, I was never afraid of sodium. I had done my research on it. I'm like, that isn't the problem. Hyperinsulinemia, refined carbohydrates, too many calories, those are the problems. But I didn't fully appreciate how critical it was to, if one wants to eat low carb or just less refined food, we really need to address electrolytes, in particular sodium. And so that just isn't something that's part of the common discussion within low carb arenas. And within fasting, I would say it borders on a dumpster fire, to be honest, because we have people who it becomes this badge of honor, almost like sleep deprivation. It's like, well, if you just try harder, then the heart palpitations, the loss of hair, the disordered sleep, and all the rest of this stuff will kind of sort itself out. And, when we think about what things are really important to be monitored from a physiological perspective, like if you or I ended up unconscious after being under the bus, being pitched under the bus, and we ended up in an emergency room, the emergency room physician would look at 2 things straight out of the gate. The first is pH and the other is electrolytes, because those two are the 2 most tightly regulated things in our physiology. And if our pH goes up or down too much for too long, we will get sick or we will die. If our electrolytes become disordered too much or for too long, we will get sick and we will die. And it doesn't take a whole lot to do that. And the loss of sodium associated with fasting is jaw-dropping, particularly if somebody is going from kind of a mixed standard American diet, and then they cut everything out and they're just doing water, and 3 days into that experience, they are shedding water and sodium, and then like crazy. And we have to have a balance between sodium, potassium, magnesium, calcium, and all these other electrolytes. And typically we have sodium in higher concentrations outside of cells, potassium in higher concentrations inside of cells. When we start dumping sodium like crazy, then our body will start dumping potassium to try to maintain that balance. Because if we don't have the relative ratio correct, then every single nerve impulse in our body, every thought, every heartbeat, every muscle contraction stops. So our body starts then dumping potassium. And this is where people end up in a downward spiral very, very quickly, and they can die from it. They will feel horrible beforehand, and usually they will do something to fix things, but occasionally folks are knuckleheads and they're like, well, I'm really going to muscle through this thing. And, my guru told me I should do this and should do that. And I mean, I don't know if I fully addressed what, the question there, but when individuals begin fasting, when they reduce carbohydrate intake, insulin levels drop. Insulin manages a hormone called aldosterone. Aldosterone causes us to retain sodium. So under normal circumstances, we have this kind of homeostatic balance. Insulin, aldosterone, sodium are all kind of in a dynamic equilibrium, and our blood pressure is normal. We go from seated to standing and we don't get dizzy. We don't have super high heart rate, just trying to breathe and stuff like that. And then when we begin fasting, our insulin levels drop, aldosterone drops, and then we begin shedding sodium and water, and then eventually potassium and water. And it embarks on this really terrible downward spiral, which can be life-threatening. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I want to address that in 1 second. Let's go back to the potassium thing. So what I see a lot in fasters is restless legs. It's like the ache. And I hear a lot, people will ask questions like, well, I can't sleep at night. My legs are aching. My low back is aching. I've seen some research connecting restless legs with low potassium. So a lot of muscle, not atrophy, but agitation and nerve pain can come from low potassium. Do you think that's why?
Yeah, but the way that they got there is their sodium plummeted, and then their body started dumping potassium to try to balance the sodium and potassium. The most horrible thing that the person could do in that scenario is to start dosing on potassium. Like
explain why.
They will die from it. Like a lethal injection is a super concentrated solution of potassium because it causes the heart to cramp one last time.
Okay.
And without sodium and without calcium and whatnot to reverse that, then this thing is it's funny. It's a really difficult thing to unpack all this stuff because modern diets are really potassium deficient without a doubt. But people are mainly eating prodigious amounts of processed foods. I think there was just a study that suggested greater than like 70% of the food consumed in the United States is now considered hyper processed. So it's stuff that you expected only to see in like a 7-Eleven, and now this is like the basis of the diet. But these things are sodium rich typically and potassium depleted, so that's absolutely a problem. But then when we flip around and we have people fasting and eating, whole food based diets, then they're typically very potassium rich if we're eating real food, but then we're sodium depleted. But without a doubt, folks can get into a dangerous scenario in which they are potassium depleted, but it's potassium depletion on the heels of sodium depletion. And it's worth mentioning that people can overconsume a remarkable amount of sodium, and they may gain a little bit of water weight, but within 20 minutes to an hour, the kidneys are really adept at sorting out overconsumption of sodium. Overconsumption of potassium, particularly in highly concentrated form, or if anybody knows someone who is on dialysis or something like that, you have to be remarkably careful about the amount of potassium that one consumes, because that will kill you. Overconsumption of sodium is much less dangerous than overconsumption of potassium, but I feel like an idiot saying that because almost nobody overconsumes potassium in the modern world because they're eating super processed foods. But this is where we have to be very nuanced and compartmentalize this stuff really succinctly, because what our neighbor who is eating a terrible highly processed diet and they are not fasting, what might be appropriate for that person is an avocado or banana. The person who is fasting and they are in a hyponatremic state, low sodium state, and they've dumped a bunch of potassium to boot, they need sodium first, not because once you start getting sodium, then the body will retain the potassium that it comes in contact with and it will start rebuilding that equilibrium.
So if you go from standard American diet or Western diet, I should probably call it now because it's
everywhere.
It's
Yeah.
everywhere. We've taken our
Right.
horrible food everywhere. And now you move to a clean diet where you're eating like from farmers markets and you're going back to nature's foods. Can you make that assumption that your sodium levels have probably gone down and it would be smart to add in something like sea salt? Is it that simple of a shift?
Yeah, for sure.
And-
I will say for a lot of people, salting their food is not enough ultimately. And we can gauge that based off of symptoms like foggy headedness, fatigue, cramping, things like that. But at a minimum, and I can't remember the name of the YouTube channel, but it's this guy in Azerbaijan, and he lives in this beautiful area, and he cooks virtually all of his food outside. Like it's like the outdoor cook or something, and it's just stunning stuff. But what you notice is this guy, it's like a lot of meat, a lot of like root vegetables, because they live in this mountainous area, and it's salt on everything. Like they salt the meat, they salt the vegetables, they salt their tea. When they're drinking tea, they put a little pinch of salt in their tea because they live at elevation. They have they're not like low carb, but they're not eating any processed carbs.
Right.
And they just instinctively like really salt the heck out of their food, their tea, everything. I'll try to pull this thing down. One, it's just breathtaking cinematography.
I'd love to know that.
Beautiful. But this is when you look at traditional cultures that if they can get access to a lot of salt, they typically put a lot of salt in their diet. Traditional Japanese diets, Okinawan diets, like they typically have a lot of sodium in the mix of an otherwise whole food, minimally processed diet. The real challenge starts emerging when we have a nutrient devoid, highly processed diet plus a lot of sodium. Yeah.
Okay. I think that's such a powerful explanation because, again, I'm going to say when I brought Element to my fasters, the first question I got was, why is there so much sodium in it? And I want to point out that what I just heard from you is if you're going from Western diet to a clean whole foods diet and then to fasting, you're probably not going to feel the effects of the electrolyte imbalance as much. This is my interpretation of what you said. Whereas if you go straight from Western diet, now I'm going to throw in some fasting and you don't take that intermittent step, that's where we may see more of these electrolytes go down. Would that be fair? Or
you will feel it worse, but I mean, this is the condition is the naturesis of fasting. When people begin fasting,
so no matter how,
shed.
Got it.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
And this
perfect.
is why, and sometimes people motor through and they get through it, these extended water only fast, but one medically, I would argue if one participates in a medically supervised fast, one is administered significant amounts of electrolytes, specifically sodium, so that we avoid all these problems. I would say that people are playing with fire from a medical perspective, not addressing these basic electrolyte issues. And I'm as critical and cranky of kind of modern medicine as anybody you could find, but emergency medicine borders on the miraculous.
Yes,
you show
agreed.
up with pH imbalances, electrolyte imbalances, you've been shot, you've been run over by a bus, whatever. It's miraculous in the acute phase. And so I think one would be really foolish to dismiss the way that acute level fasting is managed in a medical, setting. And they address those electrolytes because there's no downside to doing it. Like you feel better, you don't feel so awful, you typically sleep better, better energy levels. And the upside is that you don't die and you don't end up hospitalized for disordered electrolytes. So it seems like a real easy, cost benefit analysis on that. Yeah. Okay.
So I think this is super important because what I saw, so last week we did with our community a 3-day water fast. And it was all on a public platform. So these people are self-monitoring, they're on, I show them what to do and they go and do it. But a lot of them don't have doctor supervision and they did it really successfully. And the number one thing that I saw in hundreds of thousands of comments was, oh my gosh, Element saved me. It was the thing that got me through. And so it was so ironic that I was talking to you today because that went down last week. And I'm like, why did that happen? And my next question to you, is it only in the longer fasts that we need to add in our electrolytes? Or what if I'm intermittent fasting 15 hours every day? What if I'm doing one meal a day? Like, where is it always? Should I be doing a packet a day? Like, how do I know how much is right for me?
So the dosing question is ironically like the most difficult question to answer. Are you a 6'6" male who plays hockey? Are you a 5'2" female who's a computer programmer and spends the bulk of the time indoors in a temperature controlled environment? Like there's just massive variation on that side of things. We tend to bracket, and we have some reasoning behind this, somewhere between 5 grams of sodium a day from all sources, dietary sources, supplemental sources, all the way up to 12 to 15 grams of sodium per day, depending on the person. So we've done some work with strength and conditioning coaches that manage hockey players, National Hockey League players, big dudes, lots of activity, even though they're on ice, like that gear is very, very hot. These big guys will lose 10 pounds of water and 10 grams of sodium in a 2-hour game in a
Just
hard
through sweat.
practice, just from their sweat,
Crazy.
We've seen small females that are competing in the CrossFit games type stuff that need 15 grams of sodium a day because they're super high motor output, their recovery is improved, they're outside in direct sunlight, maybe a little bit of humidity. So we tend to recommend that most folks, so long as they're not hypertensive, they're not insulin resistant, that somewhere around 5 grams of sodium per day is like a bare minimum, period, like across the board. And again, we're not suggesting that you do that all from elements like olives, pickles, salami, sardines, really aggressively salting your food as well. That can add a lot to things. 10 Kalamata olives provide a gram of sodium. Like that's an easy way to tick 1/5 of your sodium box. And they taste delicious. They're full of polyphenols and all that
They're
stuff.
the hero. I've decided that the olive is the hero of the day.
Yeah, without a doubt. They're way better than avocados when you get right down to it.
Yeah, it has so much fat. It's like, it has no calories. So like when we started doing fast mimicking, I was teaching fast mimicking for a little while. And it was like, oh my God, everybody was going to olives because it had no calories. It was all fat, had no carbs. And we just have learned in my household, until I discovered Element, I was like popping olives all the time, and it made me feel so good. So funny that you say that.
So it's hard to give an exact number for people because it varies a lot, but somewhere between 5 and potentially as high as 15 grams. But the 15 grams is for like athletes or super high motor, people in a hot, humid environment, altitude. If somebody's at significant altitude, like 8,000 feet or higher, mountaineering or just hanging out, that really increases electrolyte needs. But it's difficult. I can way more easily say, okay, you're a 5'4" female, 130 pounds, you need this much protein, carbs, and fat. Like I can do that pretty quick and easy and be within 5% of being accurate. On the sodium and electrolyte side, there's much more variation because there's a lot more going on there.
Okay. So if you are an athlete that's sweating a lot and then you're going to go fast, you probably are going to need more. If you're a larger man and you're going to fast, you're probably going to need more. So looking at your behavior and how much you're excreting these electrolytes would be a good indicator as to how much you would need going into a fast. Would that be accurate?
And I acknowledge that it's self-serving for the guy who owns the electrolyte company to say you need to take more. But that said, we have a free homebrew deal. So if people don't want to buy it, we have a homebrew guide. So this much salt, this much no salt, this much magnesium citrate, some lemon juice, stevia, make it yourself. And the whole company was founded where we gave away this homebrew guide, and within 6 months we had 500,000 downloads of it, and then people started asking for basically what Element is. But here's the thing, I am still surprised by how much sodium folks benefit from.
Right. I am
feel
too.
better, their performance is better, their recovery is better. And so and again, we'd like to see as much of that come from dietary sources as we can. But at the end of the day, something like a beverage, like I'm doing some coffee with a little bit of cream and then a chocolate salt element in here. And so I'll sip on that over the course of a couple hours, and it tastes great. And I feel much better with that. And then when I go to jujitsu, I won't be dragging, I'm kind of salt loading before doing jujitsu later in the afternoon. Yeah.
So explain the sodium myth of everybody, the first reaction our community had when we brought Element to them was, whoa, like, isn't that going to raise my blood pressure? Like, I feel like we have this sodium myth that needs to be debunked. Why does sodium not raise blood pressure? You've talked a lot about why it's so good, but I just want for all the skeptics out there to understand there's more to the sodium story than they've been taught.
Well, the sodium can and does raise blood pressure, but we need context. If you are fasting and you're experiencing almost hypovolemic shock when you go from seated to standing and you almost pass out, you need to raise your blood pressure a bit. If your heart is beating out of your chest because of low blood volume and you're getting cardiac arrhythmias because your heart is working overtime just sitting, then you need elevated blood pressure. Like, you're going to benefit from that. Where we need to be careful is if somebody is insulin resistant, borderline diabetic, and they're what's called a sodium sensitive hyperresponder, they can get a significant increase in their blood pressure from a large bolus of sodium. Like they do a Mexican meal or a Chinese food meal or something that's got 3 grams, 3,000 milligrams of sodium in it. And that could be a problem. But the problem isn't really the sodium. The problem is the food that the person is eating that is making them insulin resistant in the first place. One of the key benefits of both fasting and any type of a lower carb diet or a lower processed carb diet is that people lose a bunch of water weight. That water weight is their high blood pressure. They're literally peeing their high blood pressure away. And it's worth mentioning in this story, there've been a lot of very well conducted studies where they will put hypertensive individuals, folks with high blood pressure, on low or no sodium diets, and their blood pressure barely comes down at all. So low sodium diets don't necessarily fix the problem. Low carb diets and interestingly, fasting, like that is low carb diets bring down blood pressure in most individuals with hypertension. Fasting brings down blood pressure in all hypertensive individuals every single time because of this thing called the natriuresis of fasting. Like, it is the big hammer that will address this. Now, the thing is, people can't fast forever. Like, you do have to eat again, and we have to establish some sort of reasonable eating schedule around that. And for some people, it's OMAD. For other people, it's low carb or, a constrained feeding window or whatever. But some degree of insulin management almost universally addresses that hypertensive problem. So sodium is a problem in certain circumstances, and it is absolutely the only solution in all these other circumstances. So again, it's really important to recognize what we have going on there. And truth be told, there was a study released maybe 6 years ago that suggested that fewer than 12% of Americans are metabolically healthy.
Right.
So it's not surprising that for a lot of people, it's like, well, we really should address your diet to get this thing going. But the interesting thing with that, people change their diet, they implement some fasting or some time restricted eating, they feel like garbage, and then they abandon the process. Part of the reason why they feel like garbage is that their sodium levels are too low. So it kind of circles back on that. A great way to facilitate people staying on these programs. It's already hard to do these things. It's kind of socially isolating. It's a challenge anyway. But make someone feel horrible in the meantime, make them feel like they've had the worst hangover of their life and it's going on day after day after day. that's a really big ask for somebody to continue with that. But if we just address those electrolytes, then typically things normalize. And I guess the one final thought on that is if people are really concerned about blood pressure, get a $15 or $20 blood pressure cuff from a local pharmacy or order it off online, and take your blood pressure intermittently throughout the day, before taking something like Element, after taking it, and just kind of see what your blood pressure is doing. It's a really easy process to document that.
Yeah. I was just thinking to myself, if there's anything we learned from 2020 and 2021 is that humans can do hard things. Who would have thought masking up and quarantine people that we could do that? So I agree with you that when going into these longer fasts is hard, but again, this is why I love your product. And I love that you guys have a home recipe. I think that's great as well. But fasting, the research on fasting is so impressive as far as the metabolic changes it can make. And when I look at the food industry and I go, gosh, that is a big beast to take down, and they are going to keep putting garbage in our ingredients. But if I could get people to just take their garbage food and compress it into one eating window and elongate their fasting window, okay, now we're actually making some metabolic process. But I agree that the hurdle becomes, okay, what do we do when they feel bad? Because, I agree that we don't like to feel bad, but I mean, I've talked to so many fasters that get on the other side of that, and they're just like, this is the most incredible tool I've ever found. So, yeah. So one of the things I heard on sodium, I'm curious and I think I heard this in what you were saying, is that if insulin is high and sodium is high, now we have a problem. Would you agree?
Yeah. And chronically elevated insulin, which is usually facilitated by a highly processed diet where, this is where like the macronutrient wars, like the low carb people say it's all carbs, the low fat people say it's all fat. The things that people tend to overeat are fat carb combos that are massaged and managed in such a way to be hyper palatable. That's what my whole second book was about, was the neuroregulation of appetite, and just getting these really complex palate experiences. That is a guarantee of overeating. And then one of the things also that makes food taste better is sodium. So I mean, it's a key ingredient in processed food. So there's kind of a guilt by association thing there, but sodium makes whole, like if you're doing some Brussels sprouts, when you cook them in some olive oil and you put some balsamic, vinegar in it and reduce it and caramelize it, that's going to be pretty good. But man, you throw some salt on top of that and now it's magic. And it would have been, totally blasé with without that sodium on it. So it improves good food and it improves highly processed food too.
I'm going to quote you on that when I eat dinner next time. The salt container sits right by my meal every time my son and we pass it back and forth. And the chronic statement of any guest that's at our dinner table is like, wow, you guys eat a lot of salt. And my response is, yeah, you should. Our blood pressure is great. Like our health is awesome. Like we're living examples that eating the right salt with the right diet combined with fasting is working for us.
Right.
So, but the belief is salt is still going to cause high blood pressure. So I appreciate the explanation.
Yeah, it is definitely not the cause. It is a factor in the story. But again, for individuals that are sodium sensitive hyper responders, they are typically insulin resistant, and even sodium restriction doesn't necessarily help that much. Now, eating a ton of salt on top of that doesn't make things better, but super severe sodium restriction also doesn't really change things all that much. Like you really have to fundamentally change the diet and circadian rhythm and all that type of stuff. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's talk about magnesium. And thank you for the sodium discussion, because again, we've been getting a lot of questions on that. I wanted to give people a resource for that. But let's talk about magnesium. That is the other one that I feel like you could give magnesium to every human on the planet, but especially women and especially menopausal women. You give them magnesium and their life changes. What is it that is so powerful about magnesium, and why are we missing magnesium so much in our diet?
Magnesium gets complex. Again, not to overly beat the drum of sodium, but if we have adequate sodium, we tend to retain the magnesium we have. If we are deficient in sodium, then we tend to excrete more magnesium. So this is another,
they work in combination.
Thing that we need to work in there. We need adequate levels of vitamin D. Everybody thinks about vitamin D as it relates to calcium, but vitamin D and the magnesium metabolism is really important. So it starts getting very holistic rather quickly. You need adequate stomach acid to absorb magnesium and calcium. So, so there's lots of different layers where this stuff can kind of go sideways.
What vitamin D levels? Sorry to interrupt you. I'm just curious, what vitamin D levels do you feel are good for people?
I like to refer folks to Chris Masterjohn's work on this, because he breaks it down by kind of ethnicity. So if you're African-American versus Asian versus Northern Indian, he has some data that makes the case that like Caucasians probably benefit from, anywhere from like 65 to 75, with that level. African Americans may legitimately be at their optimum more in the 40 to 60. And so I really like referring that. I know enough about that to recommend go check out Chris.
We'll put a link on that.
But I would say that varies from person to person. And Chris makes this point too. It is critically important to get adequate K2 in addition to the D3. Vitamin D causes us to retain calcium. It doesn't necessarily tell it where to go. And if we have inadequate K2 in the diet, it could go into our vascular endothelium and accelerate atherosclerosis. Could do all kinds of things that we would prefer it not to do. And the K2 kind of tells the body where to partition it more in the bones and whatnot. But the magnesium deficiency is a big deal. Magnesium does this kind of interesting trick or facilitates ATP in the body because of the way it kind of coordinates the ATP molecule. The magnesium is a 2 charged metal ion, and just it associates with ATP in this way that kind of facilitates the enzymatic breakdown. So if people are low energy, if they're having kind of lethargy and fatigue, this inadequate magnesium can definitely be a factor there. It's critical in muscle contractions. It's critical in a host of different enzyme systems. So it has really broad ranging application. And diets in general are depleted of magnesium. People tend to have low stomach acid, consuming, so like if you have a magnesium rich meal, but you consume it with some dairy, sometimes like the dairy proteins can associate with the magnesium and make it difficult to absorb. So and that gets into all kinds of crazy food combining stuff, but it can be challenging to get adequate magnesium for sure. But with Element, we looked at folks that were consuming, about 300 people that were consuming a low carb but minimally processed whole food diet. And what we found was that they got, from our perspective, adequate calcium, a little skinny on magnesium, pretty, a little bit shorter on potassium, and then really, really deficient in sodium. And so that's the way that we stratified out that a gram of sodium, 200 milligrams potassium, and then 60 milligrams of magnesium. So we just put a little pinch of the magnesium in there, and we use the magnesium malate because it's much more absorbable than most of the other forms.
Yeah, amazing. So I have to ask this question because I've become a skeptic on any like one size fits all sort of approaches to anything, whether it's food, life of any kind. And I've been noticing with all the fasters that we have that women really need to fast differently. And that's been a large part of what I've been really educating people on. So do women need to do mineral electrolytes different? Do we need to look at how we approach element different? Do we need to look at it different at different times of our cycle? Do we need more of these minerals or electrolytes like after our period? these are questions that I know women will ask me.
And my honest answer is I don't know. I don't think that it's going to be that different male versus female in like the basic needs. Like, I don't think that there's going to be an intersex difference that's significant, that's any greater than me versus you.
Right.
Just human being versus human being. Now, that said, women are much more rapid in showing nutrient deficiency problems. So over aggressive calorie restriction, over aggressive really calorie restriction at the end of the day. But another interesting thing with that, when we look at all these things, kind of like adrenal fatigue, thyroid issues and whatnot, could make a really strong case that inadequate sodium is likely a big driver in those stories. So like when we see women undergo ketogenic diets, some degree of fasting and whatnot, so long as his sodium is adequate, we really get a blunting of that kind of a downward spiral where we see like hair loss and the person getting really cold and all that type of stuff. But biology just has a much finer trigger for women, because if we're in a nutrient deficient scenario, that's not a great time to be pregnant. That's not a great time to be, potentially raising, your next offspring. So women will respond to that much more rapidly and profoundly than what we would see with men. Men may end up, some low libido or something like that, but it's kind of like, I don't know, how do you even know that, versus becoming amenorrheic and whatnot. Like that's clearly a much more profound change. So again, I don't know if I fully answered that question. I don't know to what degree it's going to vary, based off of like what part of the cycle. Like I think day-to-day activity level and temperature is going to be way more impactful than say like cycle specifically.
Yeah. I had a really interesting conversation yesterday with Dr. Laura Bryden. She's I'm sure you've crossed her path before. And we were talking about perimenopause and how when the hormones decline during the perimenopausal years, that the brain has to reboot itself and it has to get accustomed to the decline of hormones, which is why women going through perimenopause could be so irritable. We can have some anxiety. And she's like, what happens is that once you get to the other side of menopause, that it has now recalibrated and it knows how to handle these low hormones. So I asked her what nutrient would help a woman as she goes through this recalibration process. And she said magnesium. Magnesium and taurine were the two that she recommended. And again, I'm going to say, I feel like I could line up thousands of perimenopause and menopausal women and put them all on different forms of magnesium, and they'd come back and say, I feel better. So to my brain, is there some hormone magnesium connection there for women? Maybe it's more coming from fluctuating hormones or the decline in hormones, but there's something there. I just haven't dove into the science.
Yeah, I don't know. And I mean, there are folks that are pretty geeked out on the notion of, like bioidentical hormones, that they will try to replicate that more youthful hormonal profile, both for men and women. And I see some pretty remarkable benefits, from that path too. But magnesium is just one of these keystone nutrients, and it's very easy to have it depleted in the modern diet. So I think that is to some degree why it just pops up again and again and again. And when you think about its role in just energy production, if you want to make hormones, you have to manufacture ATP. If you want to go for a run, you have to manufacture ATP. If you want to write a book and think big thoughts, you have to manufacture ATP. So I mean, like if you think about the operation of a home, it's run off of electricity for the most part. Well, if I want to run the blender and the power is bad, that's not really going to work well. If I want my pump to pump water into my holding tank, that's not going to work well. And then if I can't pump water into my holding tank, then my toilets aren't going to flush and my shower won't work. So energy production is really this major, it is it is kind of what defines life from not life, is the ability to take inorganic molecules and extract energy out of them and use them as substrates to drive the processes of life. So if you have something like magnesium that's a linchpin element in energy production and something is off with that, then everything's going to be broken. Like if we have intermittent electricity in the house, everything's going to be screwy. And so if we have intermittent energy production in the body, and it may be something else, it may be related to something else, but I could make the case that just simply creating problems for energy production is enough for buggering everything else that a person has going on.
So fascinating. Again, I'm going back. If you ever get a chance, go onto my Instagram and read all the miracle. People were like, element saved me. And of course my science brain was like, why did it do? I mean, I love your guys' product, but I was like, why did it do that so well? So it was pretty profound. And now this makes a lot of sense. So is there ever a time you need to think about not taking this amount of electrolytes? Like, is there for anybody that you wouldn't want to pick up extra electrolytes?
Yeah, the sodium sensitive, hyper responder, peri-diabetic, insulin resistant individual would not benefit from sodium. They're retaining a ton of sodium already. What that person really needs to do, though, is modify their diet, circadian rhythm, exercise, and all that stuff. But to date, that's about the only person I could think of. Someone on dialysis, they would definitely want to run it by their doc to make sure that they're okay. Usually potassium is the bigger mineral of concern relative to sodium, but element does have non-trivial amounts of potassium. So I would run that by dialysis. And then like the known hypertensive individual, like they know they have over high blood pressure. But again, the interesting thing is the person with high blood pressure is unlikely to have the type of symptoms that we typically see with the naturesis of fasting. But as soon as they start fasting or low carbing or whatever, then they're going to need more sodium. But that's probably the only folks that I could think of that I would really caution against using it.
Okay. Let's move to a different nutrient in our body that I think we're deficient in. And I know you're a big fan of chatting about this one, which are amino acids. So tell me where amino acids, do we get them only in animal protein? Can we get them anywhere else? And where would they show up in fasting? We've been experimenting with a combination of the electrolytes with amino acids, putting them together, and it's killing hunger during a fasted state, and helping people actually, be able to go longer. So help me understand amino acids and protein and why everybody appears to be amino acid deficient as well.
Well, folks are definitely not eating enough protein, and there's a lot. My third book, Sacred Cow, which I think you can
it's great book.
This shoulder. Diana Rodgers really did my good friend and a registered dietitian, a brilliant woman. She really did the bulk of the heavy lifting on that, looking at the health of populations that consume adequate protein versus inadequate protein, and really what a lot of things boil down to is if one consumes inadequate protein, inadequate amino acids, then one will overconsume the other nutrients, protein or carbs or fat. There's a scientific concept, the protein leverage hypothesis, which suggests that all organisms tend to eat to a protein minimum because protein-rich foods, whether we're talking about clover for cows and horses or whether we're talking like fish and chicken for omnivores and carnivores, protein-rich foods tend to be also very nutrient dense. And so the main nutrient that the body is sensing is protein, and specifically amino acids. And when one consumes enough of that, then we tend to be satiated. We tend to not be hungry. If we underconsume protein, then we will tend to overconsume all these other foods. And, we're in an environment now where we're told that animal husbandry is unethical, It's bad for the environment. It's the primary driver of climate change. It causes cancer, causes diabetes, causes all this stuff. But when we really dig into the literature looking at, say, like vegan and vegetarian diets, it's interesting. They're very similar to what we see in developing countries where people have no or limited access to animal products, in that the people tend to overconsume starchy carbohydrates. They have over nutrient deficiencies, iron, zinc, various B vitamins, magnesium. So people can tinker a lot of different ways, but what we've found is that if body composition is a primary concern, if somebody's not in the pair of skinny jeans they want to be in, or what have you, the person never is eating adequate protein ever. I mean, we do.
If you're overweight, that was just too powerful, because if you are struggling to lose weight, it's eating more protein that's going to help you drop weight. Is that too linear of a connection?
That's it. And that is
crazy.
In my opinion, the most important starting place towards facilitating that whole process, because you will spontaneously modify your appetite. You will tend to eat fewer of the other foods. Now, if all the food you still have around looks like a buffet and it's ice cream and this, like you can still eat good protein. And then if you have shoddy options around, we will still tend to overeat. But even that said, people will tend to eat less of these bad foods so long as protein is adequate. On the extending the fast side, I could see that potentially benefiting people. I wrote my first article on fasting in 2005, and I got to be honest, by 2006, I regretted releasing that article, because I saw people go nuts over the fact it mainly went out to the CrossFit community. So you had people that were training 6 or 7 days a week. They started intermittent fasting 22 hours a day, because if 16 is good, then clearly 22 hours a day is better. And they ate 5 grams of carbs a month, and they felt good for 2 weeks, and then their hair started falling out and they had no libido. And I was like, well, you took a potentially good thing and then you made it terrible, because there were all these other allostatic stressors, allostatic load, just total stress load on the person. So I'm really in this spot where I love fasting. I think it's an amazing tool. I just discovered that I have a neurological condition called essential tremor syndrome, which I've eaten a ketogenic diet, but I've started doing a little bit more like 1 day, 2 day fast to help manage that. And it definitely helps. So a little bit of irony there, because I've actually been kind of pushing back on the fasting stuff, because I see people, in my opinion, potentially doing a bit too much of it. Like there's all this interest in autophagy and different things like that. And I think that that's great, but I'm not sure how much more upside there is versus lifting weights 2 or 3 days a week, eating a protein adequate diet, and figuring out a way to just eat such that we don't overeat. Like, and that's a big lift. Like, I just say that flippantly, and it's very hard for people to get to that. But so within that thing of like, do you need amino acids to extend the fast? Why do you need to extend the fast? What is the goal? And this is something that I think is really important, regardless of what folks are doing. It really needs to be goal driven. And maybe the goal is like, well, for one time, I just want to see how long I can fast comfortably. Yeah. Great. Yeah. But then above and beyond that, it's like, well, if your goal is autophagy, you could drink a cup of coffee, you could lift weights, you could get sun on your skin, and that all stimulates autophagy too. Yeah. And lifting weights builds bone mineral density, and it builds a hedge against aging. Sarcopenia is the loss of muscle mass as we age, is one of the most concerning things that I have. And although I know folks like Jason Fung will say, well, you release lots of growth hormone when you fast, but you're still losing lean body tissue, including organ and whatnot. We're also whittling through our stem cells, and sometimes doing that is good. animals that are fasted too aggressively end up dying young from multiple organ system failure because they have no stem cells to repair their heart, their lungs, their kidneys, and all the rest of that. So it's for me, it's a really powerful tool that I would encourage people to be very outcome driven and very goal driven. What is the specific goal you're hoping to achieve in doing this? And then where do you
100%.
where do you off ramp then? Okay, you're
Yeah.
doing these fasts. Where are you going to off ramp? Or if somebody just they land at a spot where they're like, I'm not going to change what I eat, but I will eat between the times of 9 a.m. and 4 p.m. Great. I'm right there with you. And they get more metabolically healthier. They get to a healthy body weight and all that stuff. That's great. But I just see a lot of folks kind of doing it to do it and absent a goal, and that goal is something, and I know I'm just talking like a crazy man today, but that goal for me is how we assess outcome. What is it that we're trying to do? And so then when we start doing it, we can say, well, that worked really well based off of what I wanted to achieve here. But I don't see enough people really sit down and delineate what is the goal that I'm trying to achieve here.
Don't you think the goal, I totally agree with you, because I do a weekly Q&A on fasting, and I get the question all the time, how long should I fast for X condition? How long should I fast for this? And my comments always are, well, what is your goal and what are you eating? And there's more to that. It's not something as simple as what I can answer on a live Q&A. But I think that what we're trying to do with fasting, and the way I teach it is fasting variation, we are trying to mimic our cave person day, where we went through times of feasting and we feasted on healthy food, and then we went through times of fasting. And that there was a lot of variation to that. We may have gone through the whole summer with so much food, but then go into the winter and we had to go into more of the ketogenic energy system. So if you just mimic that was not a very linear experience for cave people. It was random every single day. And that, I believe, based off what I'm seeing and the people who are applying these principles, is what we want to get back to. It's not fasting the same time all day. It's not eating the same time all day. We need variation. What are your thoughts on that?
I agree and I disagree.
Go ahead, go for it.
And I mean, I'm like the paleo guy.
Right.
So the bulk of the research is, so I have a talk that never got around much because COVID happened, and the title of the talk is Longevity, Are We Trying Too Hard? And maybe what I'll do, I'll send it to you. Please. And then you can share it with your community. But when I've been interested in it, again, like my first published article on fasting was 2005, and I'm really intrigued by this stuff. But as I started digging in, so when animals are fed a species appropriate diet and are fasted, intermittently fasted, they live shorter lives. They die younger. And
Okay.
so that's a chunk of data. When we look at what animals are fed in a lab setting, they're universally overweight. Like you have to really work to take a lab raised animal and do something to them. They have to be overtly calorie restricted to just not give them cancer, give them diabetes, cause them to be overweight. And the more and more I dug into it, I was kind of like, well, if these animals are being fed a very poor diet, and feeding them less of the very poor diet is better, like that, right. that makes sense. But again, when we start poking around and looking at more of like a species appropriate diet, I'm not sure how much upside there is waiting on the backside of a protein adequate, satiating diet that people spontaneously find calorie maintenance. Like there might be some, but I'm not sure. And I'm super in the minority on this. Like everybody is really geeked out on this stuff. And I fully acknowledge that fasting can be a great tool to get people in and started down these roads. But then I've seen folks that were avoiding protein because of mTOR and IGF.
Yeah, you're going to the extreme people.
Yeah, well, but there's a lot of them out there,
There's
and
a
they tend
lot
to
of
do a
them.
lot of
Yeah.
fasting, and they,
Yeah.
and then when they do eat, they avoid protein. And these folks were cold. They looked, they didn't look like they handled themselves in a, like if somebody tried to mug them, the mugger was getting their wallet for sure, because there was no fight there. If this person's car slid off the road and went down an embankment, I don't know if this person was like climbing their way back up the hill and hiking to get help. And so this is where I am much more in that camp of like resistance training, adequate protein, sun on your skin. And and I do some time restricted eating. Like I probably have about a 6 to 8 hour window most days. Some days it's not that. My digestion seems to be better as a consequence of that. But I'm just not super sure how much more upside exists beyond that spot. Now, that said, though, if we can't get somebody to modify the type of food they're eating, if we can't get somebody to modify the amount of food they're eating other than some sort of constrained eating window, different story. We're using it in a very targeted fashion there, but it's yeah, like I get people cranky and angry with me all the time because I'm not sure how much more upside there is in some of these scenarios. But again, for many people, that first experience of fasting, maybe the first time they've ever experienced legit ketosis, and they're like, "Oh, I could feel this clear-headed all the time. Okay, sign me up for this." This is the first time that they've been able to drive really powerful chronic inflammatory conditions basically into remission. Okay, like you've got my attention now. So I acknowledge that this thing can be a really powerful tool. I just hope that people wield it more like a jeweler's hammer than like a sledgehammer, and I see a lot of sledgehammering with it out in the interwebs. Yeah.
How my whole YouTube channel got started is I was just teaching the science that I was finding on fasting, and all the people who had read the obesity code had become, I call them the O-matters, where they had become the 1 meal a day, and they told the exact scenario that you said, where they got great results and then their health started to fall apart. And I was working with my patients, teaching them how to vary their fast and vary their foods. And I just started teaching that on YouTube. And I found, to your point, that there were a lot of people that get so obsessed with it that they do it in the extreme amount. So I would agree with you on that. Then I look at things like the New England Journal of Medicine's meta-analysis that came out and said, well, we now have decided intermittent fasting based off the research we're looking at is good for diabetes, obesity, neurodegenerative, Alzheimer's, things like that. And I think in that study, to your point, they were looking at people who were eating a horrible diet. And then all they did is add in fasting, and then they saw some incredible metabolic changes. So what I hear you is you're sort of taking the conversation to another level, where you're like, okay, that's great. But then once you've got your diet really dialed in and you're adding in more protein and you're building more muscle through working out, then where does fasting fit in at that point?
It may not need to be your primary tool, but if the individual is just like, I'm going to eat what I'm going to eat, but I'm open to eating between this time and this time, then that in my mind is where fasting is a public health tool.
Yeah. What do you think? Yeah. What do you think this 12% of Americans metabolically fit should be completely unacceptable to us? What do you think our way out? That number, it came out last year, that study, or at least became popular last year. And I found that so disturbing. And then when you look at the immune damage that happens when somebody is metabolically unhealthy, and we've only got 12% of Americans metabolically healthy, I look at that statistic, I look at the New England Journal of Medicine meta-analysis, and I say, okay, let's just get people intermittent fasting so we can improve metabolic health. What I'm hearing you say, though, is that there's more to that story. What do you think would get us metabolically healthy right now? That's simple.
I think we need I think your point is super well made. And I think that intermittent fasting can and should be a piece of the puzzle. And I think that this is what has been frustrating, is that there's been a one size fits all message coming generally from kind of mainstream dietetic circles. It's like low fat, high carb, high fiber, and that works okay for some people. Like just for me, my digestive issues, that approach crushes me just from my ulcerative colitis thing. Like it does not work. It doesn't provide appetite control. I get hungry. I get cyclically hungry. Like it's a terrible experience for me. Some people do really well with low carb diets. Some people, this time, Peter Attia did a great, this stuff has been hidden in plain sight, but he said we can encourage people to eat less of whatever it is that they're eating. And that works for almost no one, but it works for a few people. We can encourage people to eat different amounts of the foods that they're eating. And this could be high fat, low carb, could be high carb, low fat. And that works for a certain cross section of people. And then the other piece is temporal, it's timing. And so when and how are you eating? OMAD, fasting mimicking diets, et cetera. And so, given the abysmal state of maybe 12% of people are metabolically healthy, I would say after COVID, that's probably more like 9% of people, because virtually everybody got sicker and fatter being at home and being scared and terrorized and everything. So we need every tool that we can at our disposal to address this stuff. But I guess in this, you and I are talking at a pretty high level on this because we're both practitioners dealing with this stuff. And sometimes I hesitate saying anything because it can be confusing when people are just at the beginning bottleneck of this. Which direction do I go? And they just need something. They need a life jacket thrown to them. Doesn't matter what color it is, But I do see folks that get some benefit initially from any one of these interventions, whether again, people in the keto scene, they get geeked out on the autophagy and the fear of mTOR and this promise that like, if we just suppress mTOR that, we'll never get cancer and we'll live forever. And it's a lie. Like they're really taking a very myopic view of a highly complex scenario, and they end up like losing significant muscle mass. So now they're frail at a young age. And if maybe you do or don't get cancer. I don't think that modifying mTOR in the way they're describing it is going to affect that at all. But guaranteed, if you slip and fall, your likelihood of being institutionalized after that because you're incapable of caring for yourself just went through the roof because you lost all your muscle mass and your bone density sucks, Right. So these are the kind of nuanced things that I'm trying to inject into this story so that we can sift and sort people into more appropriate buckets, but also provide them these different tools, which clearly they need. Given the ubiquity of crappy food, some of the temporal part may be the only tool that we're really able to use at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And from a public health perspective, it could be that some amount of intermittent fasting or time restricted eating may be the only thing that averts like the looming catastrophes we have on neurodegenerative disease, type 2 diabetes, and obesity related issues. Yeah.
I had at the peak last year of the pandemic, I had a principal at a high school reach out to me and said, she was in South Carolina, and she said that her teachers were really scared about COVID had just come through their town, and would I get on a Zoom call with her teachers and talk to them about what they can do around their immunity. So of course I went in and talked about metabolic health. And when I got to some of the lateral changes, I was talking about just swapping out your oils for good oils versus bad oils. This one teacher, brave man, asked me, he said, if I'm standing at the peanut butter aisle and I have a choice between a peanut butter with good oils or bad oils, that's an $8 difference in that jar of peanut butter, was the way he explained it. And he's like, that's $8 that I do not have. And then another teacher said, the way my life is so full and busy being a teacher that the only way for me to even be able to eat is to drive through McDonald's, grab some food. And so they kind of pushed back on me, which was really interesting, but it gave me a perspective that's different than we're talking about and made me realize we do need a free tool. We need something that everybody can do. And even if they're going to persist with eating McDonald's.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, we see this within the meat elitist scene. Like people will say it should be grass-fed meat or nothing. And it's like, okay, so the family of 4 trying to raise kids and trying to provide nutrient dense food for their kids, the Walmart or Costco meat is just goddamn fine. And it's way superior to a bowl of cereal or goldfish for those growing kids. They get tons of nutrients. They need the protein to grow, the iron, the zinc, et cetera. And so this is kind of a funny thing. Like the seed oils, it's kind of like, yeah, like you don't want to guzzle the stuff by the gallon, but at the same time, like if you have a big jar of peanut butter and you like peanut butter and it's satiating and and you eat that with a piece of fruit as part of your 2 meals a day because you're doing some 2 mealtime restricted eating, and it's got a little bit of safflower oil in it, and we're going to shake that person down over that, we're idiots. Like that is dumb. That is so missing the bigger picture. The person going through the drive-through at McDonald's, get an extra burger patty or 2, ditch half or all of the buns. That's a huge win. And instead of a sugary soda, do a tea or even, God forbid, a diet soda. Just don't drink a ton of sugar on top of that, and then people start freaking out about like, what about aspartame? It's like, well, aspartame is probably not great, but worrying about aspartame relative to high fructose corn syrup is worrying about your dripping faucet when your house is burning down. It is so misallocating, well said. Resources there. So, and I think that this is our continual challenge, taking these big picture things to get people moving forward. Are seed oils great? No. But should you go crazy trying to avoid seed oils? Well, if you have really complex health issues and like that's kind of where you've ended up, maybe. But for the lion's share, people that just they're not doing a bagel, they're not doing nachos, like they're doing peanut butter and apples and some chicken, that's a win. Like that is win all day long. Like we can see it metabolically, the person feels better, they look better, they perform better. So
see, but this is funny. I think that was golden what you just said there, because again, I'm going to go back to this 12% because I have obsessed on how sad that number is. And I realize that we got to help the person who it doesn't have the financial resources and help them understand what they can do to become metabolically healthy, or we're never going to bring that number up. And as more emerging viruses appear and we go through more of this chaos, this metabolic health has to be the thing that we address, but we have to be able to address it for all socioeconomic backgrounds. So I love what you just said. I think that is so powerful.
We did a piece. I think I shopped exclusively for a month at Walmart, and it was like paleo, and it was easy. It was easy, and like there was tons of grass-fed meat there, and there was this, and there was that, and But the was all the produce organic? No, doesn't matter. Like it doesn't matter, particularly again relative to the family of 4 just getting going. Both parents are working, the kids are in school, they're sending school lunches if they even still can, because schools get so squirrely about like sending tree nuts and different things. Right. So you're trying to feed your kids well so that they aren't crazy. And those folks are like, we know we need to eat better. We want our kids to be healthier. And so they are only going to be allowed to shop at Whole Foods, and everything is organic, and the meat is organic and grass fed, and it's $32 a pound. It's like, this is ridiculous stuff, Right. And it's I see people dismiss ideas like fasting and keto and paleo, and they're like, well, that's just elitist, that's for wealthy people. And I really find that repugnant. I just moved my office around. I don't know if I have it, but I have a food stamp from when I was 5 years old, and I went shopping with my mom, and I was like, hey mom, what are you using there? And she's like, oh, I'll tell you when we get in the car. And she was like, so we're poor and the government sends us money, and this is some of the money we use to buy food. And I was like, okay, I'm never going to do that as an adult. Like I just but I kept this thing. And some people are in a situation where they have to, and it's great that we have safety nets. But when people just dismiss the notion that someone who is comparatively poor has no capacity to change their situation. I find that so incredibly disempowering that I literally want to throttle the person saying it. It's like, I get that they may have challenges. Let's figure out how we facilitate the ability to change that situation and support the individual, not just explain away for them how they're going to fail this from the beginning. Like, that's ridiculous to me. So yeah. Wow. And this is, you know, whether socioeconomic stuff or COVID or whatever, like these minorities and low socioeconomic standing, these are the people that are hit the hardest by all this, like the wealthy and the middle class. Yeah, they absorb it. They're able to absorb it, you know, but those are the people that we really should be thinking about. And I don't know, this is always, and I'm just diverting here, and I'm sorry if you want to cut this out, you can absolutely
it's all good. No, I'm fascinated.
But I'm not going to go there. I'm not going to go there. It'll get us so I'll use better judgment right now.
Oh my God, you're funny. Again, this is why I love intermittent fasting of all type, is because it's free. And you can give it to a CEO who has no time. You can give that tool to the teacher in South Carolina that is burning the candle at both ends and doesn't have money. And we can start to move the needle on their metabolic health. Yeah. So it takes time and money, I find, are the biggest hurdles to people being able to get well. So if we take that off the plate, now at least we're a step forward. So that's why I like, again, that study it wakes me up at night. It really burns in my brain that we've got to come up with some solutions. And when you look at what big food is doing, that's like a beast that I do not know. It's like big pharma. I just don't know how we're going to be able to stop the damage to health that these big corporations are doing. But what we can do, people like you and me, is we can empower the individual to start to figure out how to create a lifestyle based off their socioeconomic constraints or boundaries that is going to make them metabolically healthy. I personally think metabolic health is the number one health crisis right now that needs to be addressed. We don't have an immune system problem. We have a metabolic health problem. Yeah. And I just am searching for tools to be able to help these people, because it's unfair when the South Carolina teacher goes to McDonald's because she doesn't have the time and she's teaching our youth and toxifying herself, building metabolic damage, making her more immune compromised. That scenario breaks my heart and needs to change.
Well, and you know, it's funny. I was just talking about kind of the meat elitists and whatnot, but a lot of my pushback on fasting has been directed at the people who are at the outer edges of our community. It's the people who they've read every Peter Attia blog, and they have Rhonda Patrick as like a wake up voice on their phone, you know, talking about gut microbiota and stuff like that. And these are the people that I've done a lot of my recent talks catered to, because I see them going overboard. And the funny thing about that is I bitch and bemoan all the time how people are looking at this tiny top of this pyramid of lunatic fringe, and how that's going to have zero impact on the bulk of people. And so it's kind of funny. I fell prey to some of my own stuff there. And you make a really super credible case that some degree of intermittent fasting, time restricted eating is a remarkably democratic way of helping people reach better metabolic. You did some perspective changing for me, so awesome. I really appreciate that, because I've noodled on that stuff, but I haven't really couched it as much in terms from like a public health perspective. It's like, okay, are we going to win against big food? Probably not. Okay, if we just get people to eat it between these hours and these hours, at least maybe we are turning a tide of some kind. You know. Yeah.
And I only have come to this place out of two experiences. And one was when we went into the pandemic. I was very clear, we don't have a virus problem. We have a host problem. So what's going on with the host? So when I went to go research that, I saw metabolic health. But then when I had this interaction with these South Carolina teachers, my heart hurt afterwards. I thought I didn't do those people a good service. I should have just said, whatever you're eating, the research shows if you eat it in a 10-hour window and you leave 14 hours for fasting right now, that you're immune to metabolic damage. So let's just start there. That doesn't cost you any money. The whole class should have been that for those
Right.
people.
I would agree. And I think one of the gimmies is like, no liquid calories, like a diet soda in lieu of a standard soda, and then whatever else you can pull off. And I think that and try to get a whack of protein at every meal, whether it's a bag of jerky or, whatever. And I think that that's really actionable and meets people much more where they are. And it's not so complex. Like we've talked at some pretty high level stuff on this. And for the vast majority of people, that's not what they need. They just
need to know how to
feeding wheedle. Yeah.
Let's just move the needle a little bit. Let's just get, your A1C down a little bit. Let's just get you a little bit moving in a positive direction, because the way I see it right now is we're moving in such a bad direction that we got to start with the people that can't afford stuff and don't have the time and money. So
absolutely.
Yeah. Awesome. I have so many other questions for you, but I want to respect your time. The one thing I have to tell you, and I have to talk about this, when I brought Element into my house, I love the taste of it. It's, easy to drink. And my 21-year-old and 19-year-old got a hold of it. And pretty soon they figured out that it's an incredible tool post party. And all of a sudden you guys have to have a whole market for this, because my 19-year-old's about to go off to college on Saturday. And we're putting his stuff together. And he's like, can you get me some boxes of Element? So I got him like 4 boxes. His girlfriend just went off last week. I brought her a care package of a couple boxes of Element. She sends me a picture from her dorm room where she's got Element in some special spot. Explain why it's good for hangovers. And you need to open up the market for the college students.
So the funny thing is we weren't sure if Element would take as like an electrolyte product. And so the first couple of flavors were such that we could pivot and have it be a drink mix. So like the citrus, and then like the habanero lemon, and all that stuff. And so, I mean, one, it tastes really good as kind of a drink mix base. And then most of a hangover is dehydration and sodium depletion. And so if you fix the dehydration and the sodium depletion, then there's also just the basic poisoning of, detoxifying ethanol, but, by your liver. But the most of what we feel terrible from, low electrolyte status and dehydration. And so it really addresses that. And I wouldn't say it's a total get out of jail free card, but it's shocking how much worse one could feel if you've had a couple of drinks and not had Element, versus like wrapping the night up with one of those, or like, kind of going in between, or again, using that as like your drink base. It's kind of remarkable. Yeah.
No, I took it and I put it in a big jar in our house. And I'm like, now I know how much my kids are drinking, because I can go and be like, oh my gosh, where'd all the Element go? It's really amazing. But they're like, I feel good on it. So, I always just love that nutrients go back into them. The other question that I have for you that I really want to answer, and I've talked a lot, like last week I interviewed Dr. Gabrielle Lyon, who is really big on protein, as you know. And there were 2 things that I discussed with her that I've been noodling on. One is that she believes when we eat protein that you got to hit a 30-gram mark to initiate the nutrient sensors for amino acids in muscles in order to grow muscle. Would you agree with that?
Yes. And she and I are great friends, and she is maybe even more neurotic about that preventing sarcopenia than I am. Yeah.
So you would say, if I go and I eat a hard-boiled egg, which has like, 17, something like that. Like it's not a huge, but it still pretty packs a protein punch. I'm not triggering muscle growth until I eat enough hard-boiled eggs to get to that 30-gram mark.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how much protein do you feel like people need in a day?
The bracketing that I have is a gram of protein per pound of lean body mass, all the way up to a gram of protein per pound of body weight. So if we had a 200-pound male, 10% body fat, could be as low as 180 grams of protein or as high as 200, 210 grams of protein. And that seems to be a pretty good operating window there. And part of our Healthy Rebellion community, we do 3 times a year resets where people focus on food, sleep, movement, and community, kind of the 4 pillars of health. We have not had a single person who had body composition goals who was eating adequate protein, not one. Yeah. And this is in thousands of people going through this. And these are people like, Rob, I read your first book in 2010 and I got a lot of benefit. But you know, I just haven't been able to shake the last 15 pounds. And then when we really get in and look at what they're doing, we have people weigh and measure their food for about a week. And they're like, son of a gun, I was eating like 50% under the amount of protein I was supposed to eat. And we fix that and just magic happens with that. Yeah.
And so do you think there's ever a scenario where a vegetarian can thrive?
Well, so vegetarian could be, I mean, I don't exactly know what that, like vegan is. Let's start with vegan.
Yeah, like, there's lots of variations.
It's going to be tough. It's going to be tough. And what we find is that because the protein is very non-dense, they eat more calories overall. And this is that protein leverage hypothesis thing. Right. To hit their protein minimums, they end up eating more calories overall. If you look at the protein and the nutrition in 2 or 3 ounces of steak, it's like 200 calories. You need to eat 800 calories of beans and rice to get the same amino acid profile. So it's just tough. It's very tough to pull that off. You have to do a lot of protein concentrates, tofu, tempeh, things like that. It tends to be a very monochromatic diet. You know, when we shift to vegetarian, again, some people say fish works, some people say dairy works. Like the more latitude you have and the more access to relatively dense protein sources, then the easier it is to pull that off. But some people have good body composition on a kind of low protein vegan diet, or at least they're skinny. But I think it's fraught with difficulty to really make that work, particularly over the long haul.
So you should go back and talk to Gabrielle, because one thing that she mentioned is that there's a new research coming out that some people's microbiome actually will make amino acids, and those people, you probably already know about this, that those people may be okay on a vegetarian diet because they have the right microbes to make the amino acids to support. Yeah.
So it's not just what you're putting down in your pie hole, but they may be making some in addition to that.
Right. Yeah. Which is fascinating.
And this may be some of the inter-individual variation that we see, like one person does it and they do great, and another person does a vegan vegetarian diet and it just craters them.
How do you explain that? And this is where I could geek out on the microbiome, because I think that's where you explain it, is that we have such variations of the microbiome. So,
but the real takeaway there at the end of the day is that the person had to hit a protein minimum, whether they consumed protein specifically or whether their gut microbiome assisted them in hitting that protein minimum. That was a non-negotiable piece of that story. Yeah.
And how do you know if you have that strain of bacteria that's doing that? So you would only know because you might be listening to this and going, well, the vegetarian vegan diet works for me. And so that would be your only clue. So yeah. Well, this was awesome. I could chat with you all day. I have 5 questions for you. Some of them we ask every guest. Some of them are unique to you. So let me just rapid fire these at you for the last little bit we have.
I'll do my best to rapid fire answer. I do terribly at that. Yeah.
It's all good. I'm as talkative as you are. Okay. We're creating a book, a list of our guests' favorite books. So, at the end of the year, we're going to put it together. What's the one book? And you can say 1 or 2 that you feel like everybody needs to read.
Oh man. From like a health perspective?
It can be anything. Some people have said fiction. So it's like the book that just really opens your mind to something new. And you think, God, if humans just read this, they might have a different perspective.
Okay. Thomas Sowell, Economics in One Course.
Oh, Okay.
Yeah.
We haven't had that one. And so tell us why.
As ill-informed as folks are on nutrition, and probably rightfully so, they just live their lives and everything. People are shockingly ill-informed on the basics of economics.
Yeah.
And economics isn't just money, it's resources and the way that resources get allocated around the planet. Like the way a termite mound operates is an economic engine and resource reallocation engine. And in my opinion, a lot of the problems that we face societally are an outgrowth of people operating from an emotional spot of what they think the world should be versus the logical reality of what economics and resource allocation is. And Thomas Sowell is one of my favorite people in the world, a Black man born in very humble means, got a PhD in economics, ended up at Stanford, and has been a luminary in economics for 50 plus years. So amazing man, in a very accessible short piece that I think that 80 or 90% of the problems that we face today are, at least to some degree, an outgrowth of people just really not understanding economics and or the reality of economics being so at odds with what their emotional thoughts about what the world should be versus what it is, and it creates. Ironically, a lot of where people go wrong is, in my opinion, is they want to do good by people, but the path to hell is oftentimes paved on good intentions.
Yeah. And we are willing to just take a headline or a social media blurb or clickbait of some kind and then call that truth. I also think we just, on every topic, we need to teach people how to go deep in their thinking. I heard recently that actually in Finland, they're doing this with kids, where they are teaching kids how to critically think. And that is missing in our education system for sure.
Well, that it just as a little bit of funny backstory, if you do some research on where the Finnish school system came from, they sent researchers to the United States back in the 1950s and found went all over the country and found the best practices being used within our school system, and then consolidated it down and systematized it. We never systematized a lot of the good stuff that was happening here. And then we went down all these other kind of squirrely routes. But they developed a lot of the Finnish school system off of observing. Like there was a time where we had a really robust gifted and talented program. We had a very deep special ed program. So there was a lot of customization to meet the kid where they were. And over the course of time, it's become a one size fits all, which ends up serving no one.
Yeah. We even had some PE programs too that got taken away back in the day. Okay. What's the craziest thing you've ever done for your health?
For my health, man.
Or it may have ended up not being for your health, but you're willing to give it a go.
I mean, the most disastrous thing I did was a vegan diet, and trying to do that while doing a graduate program, and it nearly killed me. I thought I could just get by on 3 hours of sleep and live in Seattle and never see the sun and eat a diet that it was undigestible for me. That was catastrophic and nearly killed me. Yeah.
That makes sense. I can see that. If you could give a concise definition of health, and I'm not saying that because you like to talk, I'm just saying that we don't have a good definition of health for people. What would your definition be?
The ability to do most everything you would like to do and feel good doing it.
Amazing. I think that is a perfect definition. I have found people think it's like something that you're going to get to and you're going to arrive at. And one of the things I've been teaching my community is I feel like we shouldn't look at health as a noun, and that's how it's used in the English language. It's a verb. It's action. So we got to redefine it, which is why I love what you said. So the pandemic was crazy, but a lot of good came out of it. There are lists of good that came out of it for my family. What's a big aha and something good that came out of it for you?
Oh man. I mean, our family has been very fortunate during the whole thing, but we've seen a lot of people that really had very rough sledding during all this. It's not really that positive of a thing, but it made clear to me that social media may end up being the undoing of Western civilization.
Right. Yeah.
And I have social media accounts, but I finally really like working with people. I like helping people, but I have 100% constrained myself to doing podcasts and then being in my Healthy Rebellion community, and that's it. Like I just can't do the other stuff. I post things and I have my assistant post it, but I don't interact. I don't check comments, and it kind of guts me because I've done that for like 23 years. I love doing that. I love interacting with people, but when I learned maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago, that the algorithms are tweaked to promote conflict, it made a lot of sense, because when it was just back in the old forum days, I would chat with people about economics or, social political stuff or health or whatever. We would start off at very different places. And I wouldn't say that I convinced everybody to believe what I was saying, but at least I got, man, that is a very reasoned, thoughtful thing. And I'm going to give that some thought. At least I got that. Sometimes I got, you're an asshole and just go die, screw off.
Everybody on social media gets that.
Yeah. But that's all that we get now, and it was interesting because I'm like, wow, am I like losing my mojo? Do I not care? Am I not empathic anymore? Because I just couldn't, no matter how hard I worked to make a case and like just to get some dialogue. There was no dialoguing, and then when I think it was the Social Dilemma film, and then just some articles talking about how these companies figured out that, cat memes are cool and they make the rounds, and, good news stories are okay and they make the rounds. Nothing spreads like wildfire, like figuring out what makes someone upset. And so even to the tune that these things figure out, well, Robb doesn't really get along with Nadia, so we're going to make sure that Nadia sees as much of Robb's stuff as possible to get her inflamed, to get him inflamed. And when I figured that out, I'm like, this literally could be the undermining of what we consider Western liberal civilization. And with some of the censorship, like my website was censored back in 2017 as part of the Google OWL update, like way before getting censored was cool. I was cool. One of the first people to do it, and like overnight 97% of my site traffic disappeared because Google viewed my material as being dangerous, and the credible material that it would refer people to was WebMD. And some people might cheer that. I have lots of folks that I disagree with, vegans, whatever. I would be horrified by seeing these people deplatformed and removed. And so I know that, again, that was like not the concise answer at all, but
don't worry about the long answer. I think you're spot on that people don't realize the information that they're how it's being manipulated and brought into their brains. And like you, one of the things that I saw through the pandemic was to be able to put content out there and then distance myself, so I'm not attached to how that content's being used on this free platform. And then I've been like, let me get people into, like, you have your Health Rebellion group, I have a Reset Academy, like get them there so we can have conversations. So I started a coffee talk with my group on Zoom every Saturday morning. And it's so freeing because we're on Zoom. I'm just bringing the information that I'm seeing as it pertains to metabolic health and immune system. And we could have a really cool dialogue, and that we can't have on social media anymore.
Right. And that maybe we will, my wife and I were talking, and I was like, if we went back to like forums and blogs, that was kind of the golden age of the internet in a way, because you could find a lot of information, you could find some community. People could be jerks, but it wasn't this weaponized thing. And with the emergence of things like Substack and Medium and doing these kind of private communities, maybe we will turn the corner on that, and we'll get something more akin to that. Because part of what I loved about interacting with people on Facebook and Instagram and stuff like that, I learned an enormous amount because you get several thousand people who are sharp and they're reading all the papers and they're listening to all the podcasts. And like, hey, Rob, have you heard of this? I'm like, no, I haven't heard of that at all. Like, tell me more. And, it was a good way to get smart fast, by having a smart group of people around you that, supported that. So maybe maybe that is the silver lining in all this stuff.
Yeah. And I think you and I both come from the space of, we're not trying to get people to think like us. We're just trying to show you some evidence and then you make the decision for yourself.
Options.
That to me, should be what social media stands for, but it doesn't stand for that anymore. But in a podcast, in a Zoom call, we can start to get people to think again. That, outside of metabolic health, that's my next quest, is let's get people to think about this deeper. Let's help them find their N of one. We got to go back to that. But if everything on social media has been censored and put into a really big box, it's just not, that's really difficult because you're getting one message and that's it.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Okay. Last question. And I could chat with you forever, but if you had one message for the world, you could get into everybody's brain, what would that message be?
Oh man. This is geeky, but I kind of alluded to this. I really think if everybody had a high school physics level understanding of the way the world works, like thermodynamics, energy inputs and outputs, a basic economics perspective, like this economics in one lesson, and then a basic understanding of evolutionary theory. Like, it doesn't give you all the answers, but it allows you to at least begin asking questions. And in my opinion, absent those three things, evolution, economics, and thermodynamics, the world is effectively magic for people. Like, they literally have no idea whatsoever why things work. So we did this Sacred Cow book, and one of the examples I use in there, ethanol is held up as this green fuel, and people in corn states are going to cheer that, but it costs more energy than what it gives you. The people raising corn for ethanol drive their tractors on diesel and gasoline because it costs more than what it gives. And so it's a boondoggle. It's a complete farce to say that this is a green thing. And there, when we talk about climate change and food policy and all kinds of other stuff, again, I see people, for misaligned financial reasons, for kind of simplistic emotional reasons, they will look at something like, well, is ethanol a good viable fuel? And they're like, well, yeah, it comes from corn. That's got to be great. And it's like, well, it actually costs more energy than what it takes. And I think if people had a basic understanding of that, and this is going to sound super hoity-toity, but for a lot of people, I don't even think they know enough to ask the right question. Agreed. So they're not even on the right planet to get the right answer. Right. They're not even, they're not in that, we're in a Zoom room. They're not even in the Zoom room of getting the right answer because they haven't even asked remotely a reasonable question yet. And I think that people would struggle a lot less. They would find a lot less negative surprise in their lives because they could kind of intuit and anticipate a lot of the things that are happening around them instead of it happening to them. And one of the best ways that you can, I'll flip this around. One of the most stressful experiences people have is a lack of agency, sensing a lack of agency, an inability to do anything to change their situation. But if you just allow people the ability to understand what it is that's happening to them, like I've been a little bit of a doomsday prepper for 15 years. I was the one that thought that the housing market was going to blow up in 2005. I couldn't believe it took until 2008 to go. I was just flabbergasted, but I knew that was going to happen. I just didn't know when, and the timing is really important. But when it did happen, it wasn't as stressful as it was for many people. I didn't make the decisions that got me in trouble. I missed a lot of opportunities, but it's for stuff like that, it's better to be early than late, So, and even with this pandemic, I've known ages that the potential of a pandemic or an EMP pulse or something like that was real, that food distribution could be interrupted, that, you know, you could have social unrest and all kinds of other things. And it doesn't insulate you from all the effect, but you're not in that terrified, paralyzed moment because it's a complete surprise. Oh, how on earth did this happen? Well,
Yeah, well said.
yeah,
Well said.
yeah. 10 Kalamata olives provide a gram of sodium. Like, that's an easy way to tick 1/5 of your sodium.
I've decided that the olive is the hero of the day.
Yeah,
like-
yeah, without a doubt. They're
It
way
has-
better than avocados when you get right down to it.
Yeah, it has so
Yeah.
much fat. It's like, it has no calories.